This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On April the 24th, the Institute hosted the fourth in its series of annual conferences on themes in defense and security studies. This year's conference focused on global challenges to Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic.
So without further ado, I'll ask Colonel Richardson to come forward and talk about the Canadian Rangers. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Do you ever wonder about how the twists of fate affect you in life? Like how some kid from Port Colborne, Ontario ends up speaking to at the RCMI about sovereignty in Canada's Arctic? But it's kind of similar to the way I ended up being the commanding officer of the 3rd Canadian Ranger Patrol Group. My only time in the Arctic was in Norway. It wasn't even in Canada. But it was a winter warfare training, and I learned some of the hardships and heard the Norwegian people talk about climate change there and how things were warming, how people in the Arctic who lived in the Arctic weren't outside and weren't doing as much as they had been in the past. As commanding officer of the Lincoln Welland Regiment, I took that to heart, and we worked with the Rangers. I worked with 3CRPG when I was with the Lincoln Welland, and actually that's where I met my regimental sergeant major for the very first time. I worked with 2 Group, the 2nd Canadian Ranger Patrol Group the next year, and moved on. So when, fat and happy as a police officer in Fort Erie, I was talking on the phone with my friend who's also a reservist, who was a police officer in St. Catharines, one night shift, talking about the Reserve Employment Opportunity website. And we saw, we're looking at it together, and we saw, there's a lieutenant colonel job with 3CRPG open in Barrie. That'd be kind of neat. Flash forward to the next Thursday night, I'm up at brigade headquarters in London, and I say to the brigade commander, well, that exact same thing, that would be kind of neat. He said, would you like the job? I said, that would be awesome. Well, flash forward again a week or so, when I get a phone call, I'm out for a run, a jog, a quick walk. I'm out, outside. And a phone call, and it's then Brigadier General Julian Chapman, who in between my huffing and puffing, I could hear him saying, hey, if we offer you this job, would you take it? And I said, for sure. And he said, well, when could you start? I said, well, I'd have to quit my job on the police force. Give me a couple weeks. He says, how about Wednesday? I said, you're on. He said, good, be in Borden on Monday. So there I was on Monday, driving to Borden, Wednesday flying up to the change of command ceremony, and I learned my first lesson about the Canadian Rangers. Travel takes a couple of days. So here's some slides. That's a command, me taking over, thinking I know what I'm getting myself into, having worked with the Rangers and worked up, been up in the Arctic. But you see the Grand Chief there in the corner is Chief Harvey Yesno. And as soon as the change of command parade was over, he pulled me over. The change of command took place at Camp Loon, our summer youth camp. And he pulled me aside and was just before they presented us with the NAN flag, said to me, look out there. This is our future. These kids. I've written off their parents. This is where we need to work. Well, talk about getting your marching orders. It was then that I knew where this time was going to go. So then I came home because I actually had to go back to work with the police force for another week while my resignation went through the thing. And I was saying to my wife, like, you ever imagine in your wildest dreams that that one day I'd be in command of the Rangers? And just to keep me honest, she said, well, actually, you don't really play a major part in a lot of my wildest dreams. So who are the Rangers? So Rangers are a unit of the Canadian Army. They operate in the remote, sparsely populated areas in northern Canada. They started off. I didn't think Whitney was going to be here, so he can correct me later. So they started off World War II. They were actually on the West Coast, and they were actually looking for the Russian submarines, Japanese during World War II, coming in that way. But after the war, they were disbanded. That threat wasn't there anymore. But soon the next threat was the Russians, and they started off, surveillance, looking for aircraft, flying over the North Pole, bombers coming in to attack the United States or Canada. That sort of went by the wayside a little bit with the intercontinental ballistic missiles, but we put up radar sites, and then they guarded those for a little bit. In Ontario, the need to guard those kind of dwindled after a few years, and the Rangers in Ontario were largely forgotten for a couple of decades until the 90s, when the sort of after Oka and Ipperwash First Nation crises, the idea came up again that we have First Nations who are in sparsely populated remote areas of northern Ontario and other provinces, and Rangers sort of came back into being. So 1992, Rangers in Ontario was stood up with our first patrol opening in 1994 in Moose Factory, and we've grown since then. So there is actually 5 different Ranger Patrol groups in Canada. One was the original Northern Rangers up in one group, covering the Arctic. 2 is Quebec, 3 is us here in Ontario, 4 is the sort of the tips of the prairie provinces and into BC, and 5 is Newfoundland and Labrador. Now, I'm the commanding officer of the 3rd Canadian Ranger Patrol Group, Northern Ontario, north of 50 to the edge of the tree line. Actually, when you get up into Fort Severn, Pewanik area, we're getting into some tundra areas, but it's just the edge of the tree line there. One group, who are the ones who are north of us, basically taken from the edge of that tree line up into the Arctic, are the ones who really what would be germane for this conversation today. But the way I'll tie this in is the Rangers aren't heavily equipped. They aren't terribly well trained. They get the minimal training. What they are is they're people. And the people, we heard it earlier today, people are people. So the Rangers in Ontario will have a number of capabilities very similar to the Rangers in one group in the Arctic. And I'll talk about what we do, and you can draw the parallels from there. So what really is important is who the Rangers are, what it is they do, where they live, and those conditions. So again, Ontario, you can see the yellow circle is kind of southern Ontario where we are now, and then the red circle is the area where we operate in Ontario. We're organized into two separate sides. We have our small headquarters in Borden, and we have a ranger company with 24 Canadian Ranger patrols in 24 First Nation communities in Northern Ontario. We have a whole other side, which is the Junior Canadian Rangers, our youth group that I talked about earlier about Camp Luna at my change of command, and they're similar to cadets, same age group. They do more ranger style training, but for this conversation today, I'm going to focus mainly on the Canadian Rangers, the adults that are working up there. So Ontario, presently we have about 630 Canadian Rangers. 40% are female. We are about 98.3% First Nation. We have the odd teacher, the odd cop who lives up there, who joins. But for us, we're mainly the people that live up there are First Nations. So this is the area where we operate, the red circle around Northern Ontario. These communities that our rangers come from, so they're born and raised there. They come to us with every social issue, social concern that those communities have. Generally, to us, what we've seen is a fair bit of, I'll call it uneven leadership at all levels. Their look, and especially when it considers us, some look at us as very important to their community, some look at us less so. There's tension in the communities between the band council itself and the elders, and they're trying to even amongst themselves, they're trying to figure out what direction that they're going in and how it should best be done. There has been a fair bit of economic unrest in the communities. Funding, some of the communities have been bankrupt and have been fighting their way through those problems over the 6 years I've been involved with the Rangers. The best example I can give you is Niskandiga, which is recently out of management and is booming. I actually brought our honorary colonel John Newman up to Niskandiga to show them what a poor community looked like. And there was buildings going up everywhere, and that it turned out to be a bad lesson, because now he thinks everything's growing up there. But still, there, in a lot of these communities, there's limited education opportunities. Housing is very poor, and health assistance isn't there. What that has led to is a culture of apathy. There's a fair bit of violence in the communities, abuse and suicide. So where we've located, as I said, 24 First Nations. We've grown 4 different patrols over the last 2 years. Our planned growth is 2 patrols per year for the next 4 more years. Hopefully getting to the point where we have 32 to 34 Ranger patrols up in Northern Ontario. Patrol is made up of 34 members, sort of 3 sections of 10, with patrol leadership of 4, a Junior Canadian Ranger, Master Corporal, and then the Junior Canadian Ranger program. What we have here in Borden is 10 warrant officers, sergeants, who are the Ranger instructors who travel to the north to work with the patrols there, to train the sergeants to train their patrols, and be able to do the operations that we get involved in. So here's kind of where the difference between 3 group and 1 group comes along. We don't have a whole lot of sovereignty issues in Northern Ontario. A submarine popping up in the middle of Hudson's Bay might cause us a little concern. We have had Rangers call in sightings of Russian and French aircraft flying by. When we checked later, it was Operation Open Skies. It was but our Rangers saw it, so they they're out there on the land doing their job. But mostly what we get involved in is flood watch, April to May. We have Rangers out in operations right now in Kashechewan, working with the MNRF and MTO for the evacuation of that community. And we'll be monitoring the rivers in case Attawapiskat River goes, or the Severn River. During the summer months, we're busy watching forest fires, and that's basically across Northern Ontario. And ground search and rescue goes on every day, including today. And I had to leave twice because we had 6 missing people in Pikangikum as we speak right now. And then of course we're in the area in case there's a major air disaster. So what I'm going to try and do now is see if I can get this video to work that just shows a little bit of rangers in action. So Canadian Rangers then are with the range of operations I just talked to you about, plus one group doing the sovereignty side of things, are the most domestically active operational unit in Canada. Example, just for 3CRPG, 2017, the year this movie was made, we spent 86 days on operations in Canada. We were in Saskatchewan for 18 days. We responded for 2 months to a request for assistance from 2 different First Nations for a youth suicide crisis they were undergoing, and ground search and rescues. That year there was 32, of which we sent 33 Rangers out to do the search, rescuing 22 people. This year alone, when I drove here, we had 11. As I say, we're just completing a search now for 6 missing people in Pikangikum now. So we'll say that's 12 ground search and rescues this year, plus Saskatchewan going on, and 13 people rescued then, plus the 6, I guess. Another one we got into was in, sorry, the sign's very, that's Attawapiskat First Nation. 2016 was the start of a busy year for us. In Attawapiskat, they had a youth suicide crisis. A population in community of about 1,500 people. On April 9th, they declared a state of emergency, and because of on that particular day, 11 kids overdosed on pills and were taken to the nursing station and the health center, and some were evacuated, some were held in the community. Over that month, 28 youth attempted committing suicide. Of this community of about 1,500 people, 101 attempted suicide in the 6 months leading up to that April. So Rob, the RCMI, and our DCO were coming back from visiting 2 group who were running a basic military indoctrination course while this was going on. And I was sitting on the train, so not an airplane, which is lucky because I could use my phone, which I was able to get hold through Facebook Messenger, the Rangers Patrol Sergeant, Chris Cataquapit, and asked, what can we do? And there's Chris there. And he explained to me that we're getting into the spring goose hunt. This is the time that the families, they shut down the school, they shut down the community for 2 weeks. The families take their kids out across to Akimiski Island, and they do a goose hunt. The older kids and the dads go shoot the geese. The moms and the younger kids make a teepee smoker, and they pluck the geese, they smoke it, and that's their meat for the until the fall hunt. I said, what? That sounds good. And he said, well, the problem is, it's only the parents of the kids who have parents that actually do that. They're going to take all these kids away, and they're only going to leave the at-risk kids behind. So we hummed and hawed about it, and what we did was I sent up 2 ranger instructors, so two of these warrant officers, and rangers from Kasheshewan and Fort Albany, maybe some from Moose, I forget. And they went in, and we did our own spring goose hunt with these kids, and we taught those lessons, and you can see Chris is there out with some of the kids. Down below, he's making bannock, showing them how to do that, and we did some. Carl Wolf there, one of our instructors, making the teepee for the smoker. So Chris, I guess there's a fair number of people named Beaver there. So when I'm talking to Chris, he says, you know what Mrs. Beaver said to her kid? I said, no, what? He says, shut the damn door. So then you've heard me talk a few times about Kasheshewan. This is a couple pictures from February 18, and there's a couple coming up from this year that we've had sent back. Every year Kasheshewan floods. They're a hardy group in Kasheshewan, and I'll introduce you to a couple of our rangers there. But the actual community of Kasheshewan is below sea level, so there's big dikes around the community with sluice gates that they use to control the water. So what it causes as the snow and ice melts, it starts moving downriver and hits those, and sometimes plops over. Meantime, as it hits the water that's out in James Bay, Hudson's Bay there at the corner, it hits that and then comes backing up all the way in, and then so you get a double dunking. So here's some pictures. The top left is actually, that is last year. Well, I guess both the left ones are, and the two on the right are this year. Is the ice up in the community? So you can see the chunks, the size of the chunks of ice that they're coming into over the road. But like I say, they're a hardy bunch. Let me introduce you to Joe Lazarus. He was in that video that you saw a little bit earlier. Joe's a hard guy. The story about Joe is, before I got here, and I only heard about it, but I think after having met him, I think the legend is the man is as big as the legend. He was out hunting one day on a snow machine with a trailer, and a blizzard's come up. Well, he'd only planned to be out for the day. Didn't bring a tent. Didn't bring any supplies. He had limited food, and all Joe did was get off his snow machine, turn it upside down, and crawled under, and lived there for 3 days until the blizzard blew over. Sitting there with just an air hole and a small fire, digs his way out after 3 days, flips the trailer back over, hops out of his snow machine, and carries on hunting. So hardy fella from Kasheshewan. Here's some pictures. The top right is actually last year. The bottom one is us this year, loading the luggage for the evacuation there in Cache, and the airplane's getting ready to take off. And there's another Kasheshewan, just in case you think it's only the men that are tough, let me introduce you now to Yvonne Sutherland. That's me giving her SS. Yeah, special service medal. But last year we did our winter exercise up in just outside of Attawapiskat. We snowmobiled the 16 hours there, and it took us 18 hours to get back, minus 50 degrees. The day before we came back was the night before, it was the coldest, and it's a little weather station, electronic weather station that tells you everything, and actually froze at what was it?
Minus 59.
Minus 59, and it froze solid. But Peter tells us that it doesn't get any colder than minus 60 in Ontario. So, however, here we are with Yvonne, and you can see she had a breakdown of her snow machine, and she's out in minus 50 degree weather, ripping it apart, taking the whole undercarriage off, and fixing it so that she can carry on. Hardy people up in Cache. But we do also have patrols inland, and they need the ranger help as well. This actual community at the time, I talked about earlier, where we had the 2 youth suicide crises in 2017. The first one started in Wapikika, not far from Kitchen-Makusab, and they had a crisis there, and you know. We sent up, again, ranger instructors and rangers from other communities to go in and assist. We cordoned off the streets. We were sending kids back into their houses because they're sneaking out at night out of bed, going off, setting up ropes so that the next day they could come out and hang themselves. So what we did was, again, we augmented the police. The police patrolled. We joined them. But it also, what it gave was a familiar face, someone that kids could talk to and have a chat with, rather than just be being sent home by the cops. Got everybody home. We didn't lose anybody again in Wapikika. Well, there have been suicides since. But what we've done now is we've started a ranger program, the Junior Canadian Ranger program in Wapikika, and then later in Nibinamik, to give the kids something to do. Nibinamik, sort of same time, was having a similar crisis. We didn't have a nearby patrol there, and we had to send rangers and soldiers in along with our instructors to do essentially the same thing. And it was because of the distance, because we didn't have a patrol there. It was a lot greater challenge to us, and it didn't really. It was a chain of misfortune that actually allowed us to finally get out of there. The crisis seemed to be averting. We when somebody in the heavy machinery, he backed into a transformer, spilled transformer fluid into the water system, and now we had a water crisis. So we had to bring the rangers and ranger instructors back to work on the water crisis now that the suicide crisis was over. And we didn't think we were ever going to get out of there until the forest fire came along and was going to burn down the community, so the whole community had to be evacuated, and we could start fresh when it was done. And the bottom right corner is while this is all going on, is our Camp Loon was going on, and that's the opening ceremonies at Camp Loon. So it was a busy summer. Then later that year, over a Christmas holiday, we had 2 communities that had transformer failures. One was Wawakepawan, which is another community where we didn't have a range of patrols. The other was Muskrat Dam, where we had to use military assets to fly in transformers and get the ones that were there repaired so that they were able to continue on. And the rangers then were brought there, able to, and these are 2 operations that they did on their own, led by their own patrol sergeant, and was able to go door to door, make sure people were, had firewood, that they weren't freezing to death, take them to warming centers if they didn't, and provide them the needed services. Then they guided the aircraft in with the new generator and got things going. Where am I at now? So these communities, just to reiterate, economically very poor, cost of living is high due to the transport costs for food. They do rely very much on hunting and fishing, moose, caribou, goose. Although we've noticed that with the younger generation, there's less of that. There is more reliance on the northern store and willing to stay inside and let the outside be outside. Education, most communities will go up to grade 10. There is some internet education available to get them through high school, but generally, if kids want to go to high school, they have to leave their community, go south to a regional high school. For us, it's Thunder Bay, Timmins, Pelican Falls, and they'll spend their 2 to 4 years there, either rooming in somebody's house or one of the parents will leave the family and spend 4 years away from home. I've talked enough about youth suicides, but it is a very bleak prospect for the kids up there. So here's sort of one last fellow I want to introduce you to. It's Matthew Gull. He's from Peawanuck, one of our more northern communities in Ontario, and Matthew so what I want to talk about Matthew is the pride he has in the Canadian Rangers. How this has given him something to live for. It sounds a little dramatic. It's given him something significant in his life. He's the patrol sergeant in Peawanuck, has been so since I've been here, and keeps getting voted back in year after year. He is very proactive with the Rangers. He's led many patrols out into the wilderness to rescue people, and has even volunteered to go out on other patrols. And I say, I've given you a few quick numbers about Ranger patrols that we've done. There are many more patrols that go out that we don't even hear about down here. They just go out and they do, and they don't tell us. But one particular one I do want to talk about is when Matthew volunteered to go to Waskaganish in Quebec. There was a boat overturned on the bay, on James Bay, and the search went out. But after time, they said, well, these people have drowned, and the government of Quebec, whose responsibility it is to do the search and rescue, withdrew its support, saying there's nothing more we can do. But to these First Nations communities, recovery of the bodies is very, very important. And so the community of Waskaganish has family relations with Mushkegowuk Council in Ontario. Mushkegowuk Council contacted us to see if we get ranger support, and there was a whole bunch of backing and forwards there, because two groups in Quebec, we're in Ontario, we're crossing divisional lines, we're crossing Ranger Patrol Group lines. Matthew said, heck with this, and volunteered. He and several other Rangers went over and volunteered their time over there. When he got there, he found that their command post, without the support of Rangers, without the police or military support, there was no organization, and he took it upon himself then to organize the command post. He mentored the search managers, got the charts, the flow charts, and they actually did recover another body while he was out there, and before the actual bay froze, and they were able. So the other ones came up in the spring, but they were due. The military recognized his contribution after the fact, and we were able to put him on duty during that time, and in fact, we've nominated him for a commendation for that, and we're waiting to hear how that goes. So that's Matthew Gull, and you can see how even his Christmas card, he's wearing his Ranger T-shirt. That's sort of how much pride there is in being a Ranger. A little bit about their spirituality. It really is a tough. This is a tough question. You know, we think of, you know, First Nations as being traditional, and that's largely what we see down here in the south. There's a big rift in the northern communities, where we have the very traditional Christian communities, and then we have an influx of more traditional First Nations spirituality coming into the communities. And there's some communities that they're actually at odds, because the young people are seeing some of the traditional things and bringing that back, and the old people are very dead set against it. So it is something that you know going up there that we have to be very aware of. So here's just what I think are kind of neat photos. I'll find out where I left myself here. So this is the Canadian Rangers. As I said earlier, the Canadian Rangers is about the people. The people are the Rangers. The people are the community. Our goal is to make them an indispensable community organization and have them recognized as such. These Rangers, whether here or in one group in the Arctic, have saved many lives and will continue to do so. For the amount of time we're here. So, thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. Probably some of you are surprised. If you didn't know much about the Rangers, and you know a lot more now, but you probably were surprised to hear some of the things that Matt said, coming from a big soldier in uniform, and the issues that he and his Rangers deal with. Quite an interesting and eye-opening perspective. At the RCMI, we'd like to span the tactical to the strategic level. So I would like to now invite Krista to come forward and tell us about your work in Indigenous affairs and Northern affairs. Close enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm Krista Hendriksen. I am the Director of Strategic Policy in Northern Affairs, which is part of Crown-Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, one of two departments which used to make up Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada. So the side I work on has the mandate to work with the North and to establish new relationships and support existing treaty relationships with First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Indigenous people in Canada. So it's a very exciting place to work right now. And my work over the last several years has been to follow up on a commitment that was made by the Prime Minister in 2016, which is to replace Canada's Northern Strategy, the last sort of Arctic policy that Canada had, with a new Arctic and Northern policy framework. And some of you who paid attention to the budget a couple of weeks ago would have seen that there were a number of markers about Canada's Arctic and Northern policy framework, and some investments in a range of areas that will support the eventual objectives of the framework once it is complete and announced. My role has been to lead the whole of government process to develop this new framework. We've brought together more than 30 government departments. We've been working really closely with 3 territories and 3 provinces. And I'll say a word about the provinces in a moment. We've also been working with Indigenous groups across the North as we've defined it for the new framework. The new framework goes beyond the 3 territories. It includes Northern Manitoba, Northern Quebec, and Labrador, Those are areas that are traditional territory of Inuit as well as others. And we really recognize that the challenges that face Canada's territorial north are similar to challenges faced in provincial norths across Canada, although we're limiting ourselves to 3 provinces at the moment in terms of the folks we've been working to develop the framework with. As has been mentioned a number of times in presentations today, there are some fundamental differences between the North and the rest of Canada. The territories are creatures of the federal government. They are not the same as provinces in terms of their powers. More and more territories have province-like responsibilities. Yukon and Northwest Territories have had powers devolved to them. Nunavut is in the process of devolving land and water management powers to the territory. Another really important difference between the North, and that would be the full North that I'm talking about, and the rest of Canada, is that the North is blanketed by modern treaties with Indigenous people. Inuit, Métis, and First Nations in the North are well on their way to self-determination, in many cases self-government. There's even Indigenous public government. And the creation of Nunavut itself was as a result of the Nunavut Agreement, which was a game changer for the territory. That is 20 years old just recently. The cost of living is very high compared to the South, and economic growth is different. It often actually outpaces the South, but the North is much, much smaller in terms of both in population and in the number of communities. So as I mentioned, the Prime Minister announced on December 20th in 2016 that Canada would co-develop a new Arctic policy framework with Northerners, territorial and provincial governments, and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And the intent is to replace Canada's Northern Strategy and the Statement on Canada's Arctic Foreign Policy. Alison earlier spoke a little bit about the international element that, as we're describing it right now, which will serve that replacement of Canada's Arctic Foreign Policy Statement. And this process has been ongoing for the last 2 years and has involved extensive engagement in the North, as well as with other stakeholders, academics, industry, innovators, youth, women. We've really done our very best to engage with the broadest cross-section of Northerners that we possibly can, and people in the South who are interested in the North. We were delighted to have 10 virtual engagement sessions with youth from across Canada. Our intent is not to, in fact, reinvent the wheel, because many of the things the Government of Canada is doing in the North are actually already making progress in the right direction, including Strong, Secure, Engaged, the defense policy that was announced quite recently, the Oceans Protection Plan, the Clean Growth, and Canada's commitments to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. When we started our engagement, we had identified 6 key areas that we wanted to talk to Northerners about. Infrastructure, what it takes to have strong communities, questions about the economy, the importance of science and Indigenous knowledge in terms of informing decision-making, protecting the environment and Arctic biodiversity, which we expanded very quickly to address climate change as well. We didn't mean to exclude it. It was sort of one of those communications challenges, and the Arctic in a global context. And we used this discussion guide, which is available online, you can look at it, to undertake regional roundtable discussions in all 6 of the jurisdictions, these stakeholder roundtables, and both Minister Bennett and Parliamentary Secretary Yvonne Jones went out and engaged themselves as well on the framework themes, and we also welcomed written submissions. The submissions were received by March of 2018. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what we heard overall, because I think that sort of shapes the future of the North and the Arctic that the brief suggested we should be talking about this afternoon. One of the most important things I think we heard was that stronger, healthier, and prosperous people and communities is the cornerstone for the future of the North. That people are looking to ensure that they have the facilities, the services, and the capacity to ensure well-being of people and communities. And that this is integral both to a framework, a future framework, and also to Canada's global Arctic leadership. It was really clear to us that all of these 6 areas are in fact interdependent. It's a complex system of challenges. It's not, you can't address one and expect everything to be fixed. Sheila observed that infrastructure is a really important priority, and I think that our territorial partners would absolutely echo that. We certainly have heard that very loudly and strongly from our territorial partners. But I would say that when we talk to our Indigenous partners, we hear, yeah, that's really important, but we really want that to be about schools, access to education, access to early childhood development, access to post-secondary education in people's communities. So not having to come south to the big city or even to smaller cities and leave family and social connections behind, but to in fact be able to achieve in their communities. So we recognize through all of these conversations that education, skills development, and capacity building are really key to unlocking economic opportunities. We heard this from communities, we heard this from our territorial and provincial partners, and we heard this from industry as well. Investment in social, transportation, energy, and connectivity infrastructure support all of the priorities. Connectivity is really important. I think it's really important for the Canadian Armed Forces. I know it's really important for communities. Increasingly, government services in Canada are offered virtually, and if you have really poor bandwidth, it's very difficult to access services. Banking is increasingly done digitally, and if you don't have decent bandwidth, how do you do your banking? And access to financial services is another thing that has come up. Climate change is a lived reality in Canada's Arctic. It impacts all sectors. It impacts infrastructure in particular. It drives up the cost of building permafrost melting resistant infrastructure. And one of the things that really struck me was in our conversations with our Inuit partners, that how do you conserve something that is radically changing irreversibly and is not recognizable to elders. So there's complexity in what we mean by conservation. When we talk about conservation in the South, we often think about polar bears and hungry animals, but it's also the lives of communities and how do communities adapt to an environment that does not look like it looked 20 years ago because of the rapid pace of climate change and the disappearing ice. It was observed that science and Indigenous knowledge can and must be brought together. This is one of the principles of Polar Knowledge Canada, which built the Canadian High Arctic Research Station in Cambridge Bay. It's also a key theme for our colleagues at Environment Canada who work in the Wildlife Service, and is one of the things that we're trying to integrate into government policy much more broadly. We wanted to make sure that domestic and international spheres are not considered in isolation, that what's going on with Canada's presence in the globe is really linked to what Canada is doing at home and in the North. And It was observed that security, safety, and defense, and that's a range of issues from community safety in terms of policing and justice issues, but also broader questions of strategy, Canada's place in the world, how Canada is positioned to ensure that Northerners are secure, is also linked to the economic, social, and environmental well-being of Northerners. And I'd just like to digress for a moment. Mary Simon, whose work preceded my work on this whole of government initiative, really raised the, I guess, concern that Canada's Indigenous people, specifically Inuit, have often been used as a kind of living flagpole in the North. And in fact, some of the relocations that were done in the 1950s to move Inuit into higher Arctic communities was in fact exactly that. It was to ensure that there were people living in Canada's high Arctic. And the consequences of those decisions resonate now and will resonate into the future, and are linked to the fact that even in, I would say, most people in this room's living memory, people were living on the land and not in houses in Canada's Arctic. Change has been unbelievably rapid. We think it's rapid in our lives in the South. It just magnify that by maybe 100 times. Life is completely different. It's unrecognizable from what it was even 50 years ago. We also learned that collaborative partnerships are the key to doing things well, and how we undertake to do things is as important as what we do. So it's been mentioned, some of the things that have been mentioned are the co-development regimes, which bring local people into decision-making about land use and about resource development. Those things are really important to people in the North. They're really empowering to people in the North, but there are some challenges because it's not always clear to outsiders how to access or speed along that process. We observe that Indigenous Crown partnerships are key to addressing socioeconomic gaps and moving forward together. Those gaps are larger between northern communities and the rest of Canada than any other population in Canada. And there's loads of actions that can be taken to ameliorate those gaps. And that the economic potential of the North should be developed to the benefit of all Northerners. And I think that's really key, because one of the things that our territorial partners have talked about on a relatively regularly, and you can see in some of their work, is that often what happens with some of the mining projects is that employees are in fact flown in from the south, and so the economic benefits are diminished by the fact that people are paid in the south and don't spend their money in the territories. Call this economic leakage, and it's one of the things that I think there needs to be an ambition to address in one way or another, and part of the calculus there is addressing post-secondary education and the ability of people to take up the jobs that are available. So basically encouraging and empowering people to participate in the wage economy as well as the traditional economy, which Lieutenant Colonel Richardson talked about in the Northern Ontario communities. Ultimately, we came up with 8 broad goals. Because we added in the defense and security element, and we wanted to make sure we also included infrastructure in the calculus. Where we are now is that we've undertaken a period of validation with our partners, and we're looking to finalize a new Arctic policy framework for Canada. This relates to what the future of the North is, because the intent is to set out a vision that is aspirational and inspiring and really gives teeth to addressing some of the persistent challenges, but also really embracing the benefits that the North can bring all of Canada. We have done some research that shows that infrastructure investment in the North, in fact, accrues significant investment potential for Southerners. All of Canada benefits when the North benefits. I think that's a summary of my project so far. I think there's some clear links to some of the previous presentations. I had a number of thoughts as I was listening, and I really wanted to mention in particular that the really important part of the work we're doing is that we've shifted the focus from what the North does for Canada to the people of the North. So there we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My question is actually for the commander. I was just wondering, I mean, one of the problems I think we're finding is retention, and especially in communities, we often find that the same people are tagged to be everything. And I was just wondering how you manage that. So your ranger is also your emergency preparedness person, is your firefighter, is your ambulance, like they're everything. How do you manage that? That must be a real challenge.
That's a very, very good point. And we do have that. Just in Saskatchewan, as we speak right now, the fire chief and the emergency coordinator are both Canadian Rangers, and they manage the evacuation in those functions, and the rest of the Rangers came out and worked as Rangers. One of the ways we're working on it, because we also have a little bit of a demographic difference. I alluded to it, where we have this core of Rangers who are the bush savvy, outdoor Rangers who are out doing what we expect Rangers to do, and then we have the young people who are the youth, and they go to school, and they're the ones who don't like going out into the cold. And then there's a core in the middle where they do go out, but they're too cool to be Rangers, or they're can't be bothered to be Rangers, and so what we're working on is creating an image of the Rangers, to raise the perception of the Rangers as an indispensable community organization, working with the chiefs and the councils to get them to push the right people into the Rangers, while in the meantime our Junior Canadian Ranger program, we're giving them those outdoor skills so that when they do become old enough, if they choose to be Rangers, they could, or if they'll be just good citizens if they decide to stay in the South after high school. I had a point and I forgot what it was. But
by the way, two excellent presentations, and I have questions for both of you. Thank you both. First, on the education, I support that totally. I just want to ask a question. Do you not think infrastructure in the form of the Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come, is maybe a priority in getting the schools and the hospitals up in the North? And on the Rangers, it just struck me that somehow when you were moving into suicide and other areas, are you sort of absorbing some of the roles that the RCMP used to play? I don't know. Anyway, both of them excellent.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that the idea of if they build it, they will come is a really powerful one. And I think in other parts of Canada, we've seen things like that. I'm thinking of the University of Northern British Columbia as an example, which was a huge game changer for people living in Northern British Columbia and absolutely transformed educational attainment rates for the north of BC. I think that the establishment of Yukon University out of what's now Yukon College is really a positive step in that direction, and that there's some amazing innovation going on in the Northwest Territories, in Deshinta, the Centre for Learning, and there is an enormous appetite, and in fact currently an Inuit task force or project to look at the establishment of an Inuit university in the Inuit homelands. And in fact, there is a little bit of money set aside in the budget to, in fact, undertake a project to see, basically to provide the government some advice about what the federal government should be doing to support those innovations. And it has a very broad mandate of post-secondary, so beyond university education, other kinds of education as well. And I think there's some very exciting work to do there. And so, yes, I'm completely, absolutely. The infrastructure is really important. Connectivity infrastructure, and the inclusion of people doing research actively in communities will also be transformative, I think. I feel very optimistic about the future in that respect.
Thank you. Yes, you're correct. We are definitely going off into uncharted territory. In a lot of our communities, there is one police officer, sometimes two, but that will be all they'll be in community, and they're with the crisis going on, they don't have the ability to be able to respond to something of this magnitude, and that's kind of where we saw us fitting in. I remember Rob and I were, RCMI and I were, I was standing in the doorway of his office and I was explaining what was going on, and we said, if it's not us, who's going to do it? So we saw a gap, we filled it, and bought some time for the provincial government to be able to backfill, along with the Anishinaabe Nation, to be able to get the social workers that we needed up into the communities. But yes, it's not an area where we have any training or real specific knowledge of.
Great, thanks both of you for your presentations. Matt, start. SSE Commitment 108 to expand and enhance the effectiveness of the Canadian Rangers, training and effectiveness of the Canadian Rangers, and improve their functional capability within the Canadian Armed Forces. What does that mean to the CO of 3CRPG, and what are some of the practical steps that you're conceptualizing what that might mean? And then Krista, for you, maybe a variation on the question I asked this morning, but a variation. From your perspective, can you give us a sense, education maybe is one, but what ways is the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework? What are some of the core initiatives that are going to look really different than the Northern strategies that the Canadian government has mapped out since 1970, which have been pretty consistent, whether it was the one that wasn't unveiled under the Martin government with 6 pillars or the Harper government's 4 pillars? What is it that really makes this new from your standpoint?
Okay. Thanks, Whitney. So maybe I should have mentioned earlier, so the purpose of the Canadian Rangers isn't, we aren't war fighter, we aren't creating soldiers, we're creating domestic operations, well, what the military calls domestic operations, or community support. We end up doing a lot of police support type functions. So, and right now we have a memorandum of understanding with the OPP. They provide us training in ground search and rescue, and then we support them by conducting the ground search and rescue. But so how we're taking that forward now is we're working with other community partners and provincial partners to be able to give more support into the communities. So the Ministry of Natural Resources and Firefighting, MTO for disasters at airfields, and of course carrying on more with the ground search and rescue and providing more rangers into the north of Ontario to be able to respond to these emergencies.
So thanks for a really tough question, because I would say the fundamentals of what needs to be done in the north hasn't changed that much in the last, I would say, even 40 years. there's an infrastructure deficit that to enable economic development needs to be addressed in one way or another. There are challenges in terms of socioeconomic gaps between the North and the South. And the fact is, it's a very, very large amount of Canada with a vanishingly small population with limited political oomph in the broader context of Canada. The North includes less than 1% of the population, less than 1% of the communities in Canada, and those communities are, in fact, really small compared to anything south of 60. So some of those fundamentals just have not changed. Also, the resource economy is going to continue to be important in the North for the foreseeable future, and so enabling the resource economy is going to be really important going forward. And, you know, Canada still does have questions about or concerns about Canadian sovereignty, and so questions of sovereignty and how Canada exists in the North will carry on. So in some ways, it's not going to look that different. But I would say there is a really earth-shattering and innovative difference, and that would be, one, how we went about doing this. This is not just from Ottawa's or sort of a national interest perspective. We've really worked very hard to bring in local perspectives to make sure that the voices of Northerners have been captured and will be seen in the policy framework that will eventually come out. And going forward, we're looking to set the stage to enable better decision-making, better program design, better ability for the Government of Canada to deliver on its commitments. And it is premised on working together, recognizing that nobody can do this alone, that there's a part to be played by civil society, by industry, by the private sector in various ways, and by local community decision-making. So what we're really hoping to do is not just talk about our ambition for the North, but how we're going to achieve it. And I would say it's that how we're going to achieve it that is the really transformative part that really inspires me to do my job.
Just your comments concerning Ranger, the economic impact on a community of a Ranger group, how a Ranger budget would compare to a unit budget, personnel management like authorized strengths, controlled non-effectives, that things that you've encountered before, I'm sure.
Yeah, it is fairly different. Just travel in the North is the big ticket. So a Ranger actually gets planned for 12 days of training per year plus exercises and courses, compared to a normal reservist, which is budgeted at 37 days of training per year. But then our huge costs are travel. When we don't provide any machinery up there, so any snow machines, ATVs, boats, trailers, trucks, chainsaws that we use, we have to get from the community, and as compensation for that, we have a equipment usage grant, so an allowance, say, that's given to the Ranger for him using his own snow machine, or if I go up and use one of their snow machines, he gets an allowance for that. So it's something totally different than the rest of the reserve force. The ability to be able to rent stuff on the spot. It does give us a lot more flexibility, and it does make us being able to operate there, but it makes us being able to operate there possible. Did that answer?
Any other comments you have about authorized strengths, paper strengths, controlled non-effectives?
Yeah, and that's fairly flexible for us as well, different than a reserve unit. We have Rangers in Canada that haven't paraded in 10 years. Talking to the CEO of one group at one point, he said, "We're not even sure how many of them are still alive. For some of them, we don't have an age limit in the Rangers. Our oldest Ranger is 93 years old. Abraham Meditawabin. I had the privilege of giving him his bar to his CD. Really, I should have been given his third and fourth bar, because he was one of those Rangers who was a Ranger before those lost decades on James Bay, that when guarding the radar sites. The story goes that when we when they stood up the Rangers in '93, his son showed up with his rifle and his sweatshirt and said, "Hey, my dad thought maybe you might want these back," because they were left there. But he stayed on. He's given advice still alive, and he doesn't get out on the land as much, but he's still an elder in the community and provides inspiration for and advice to the younger rangers.
Sorry, I just have a small comment, because one of the things we heard when we were talking to communities, and one of the things we've heard through our Arctic Policy Framework process was really that the rangers are important for northern communities, that the rangers are important beyond the few days a month of work that comes along with it, but it also helps with equipment, the ability to be on the land and participate more broadly, and it certainly came up over and over. So, like, I could say that there's a huge effect of the rangers, knock-on effect in communities beyond just the work that the rangers actually do.
I just have a question about the infrastructure. One of the things that I did not hear about with the establishment of critical infrastructure was communication infrastructure. And I have to tell you that the establishment of the Wawatay News Network in Sioux Lookout was a game changer for Northern Ontario for education, producing a video on small engine repair by Native people in the Wawatay studio changed the whole outlook of what we were trying to do in education in the schools. We're sending out those videos because a lot of them were not on internet or anything like that, but sending out videos produced by Native teachers or Native mechanics with Native producers, artists, etc., was a really big thing. And it seems to me that that still has to be part of the whole development of the North, rather than things coming out of CBC Toronto or anything like that, but the Northern networks.
So thank you, that's a great observation. And I would say communication infrastructure, specifically broadband infrastructure, is one of the overwhelming concerns of Northerners and Arctic residents, particularly Nunavut, which has like the worst internet in the entire country. But this is where I get to do like the future of the North. There's some really neat technology that is emerging. There are a number of both companies and governments that are looking at putting shoebox-sized satellites into mid-Earth orbit to create a web of broadband access that will in fact be best in the poles. So I think that's a huge, huge game changer. The Government of Canada did just invest in some broadband initiatives that are really intended to address that gap. But I'd really encourage you to check out CBC North and some of the other sort of communication stuff going on in the North, because Northern youth are unbelievably well connected. They are incredibly savvy users of social media that folks down here would consider archaic, but they're amazing. Facebook, it has really neat stuff. Twitter, the northern like communications on sort of the instant communications are really neat, and I totally agree. It's part of the picture. Yeah.
Hi, sorry. So you talked, or a couple of times today, people have mentioned having this sort of build-in they will come mentality, especially with high schools and university institutions, and I think it's very important, right? Obviously, that's a vehicle for social mobility and everything, but for some of these schools, like Yukon College, there's hardly any. There's there's under 1,000 people that go there. So I wonder how you balance that with how important this is, but with also the fact that these are very financially supported. You're spending a lot of money on them. Yeah.
Great question, because ultimately it costs a lot to do business in the North for Canada. Everything costs more in the North, and you cannot actually underestimate how much more things cost in the North. So that's a really good observation. But I would say in an area so great with a population so small, it's really important to think about these things from a number of perspectives. The sheer cost benefit is one perspective for sure, but I think that really thinking about what we require for accreditation, for example, which is one of the big barriers to establishing post-secondary thresholds in the North because of the small population, is one of the things that could be done. And there are huge barriers to asking people to leave relatively small communities and move to the city and try to adapt not just to a new university or college environment, but also adapt to like fundamentally, profoundly different way of life, in which you don't have your mom, your sister, your extended family around the corner, and can be really, quite frankly, very socially isolating. So I think there needs to be some innovation, I would say, in the space. That it doesn't necessarily have to be super, super expensive, but the fact is all universities are supported by the government in Canada, and, you know, do we really want to exclude people because of where they live?
For Colonel Richardson, we've heard a lot about in really troubled communities in the far north, especially for the younger people and the youth, the drug addiction, gasoline sniffing, how a young person can arrive at the feeling that suicide is actually a better alternative than living. And I wonder if you could comment on the role of the junior Rangers in tackling that.
Yeah, great point. So. And that's actually, it fits into the last question as well. With the it's the high school level is actually where we lose junior Canadian Rangers. They leave their community, they go to high school somewhere else, and you know, they get, you know, cadets lose people in high school too because they have other interests in sports and girls or boys and all things. Add to that, coming from a small community of 200 people and the draw of alcohol, drugs, and then the things you have to do to get the alcohol and the drugs, all plays in. So we've started our youth programs in those regional high schools. We do training in Thunder Bay and Timmins, Cochrane, coming up, and Pelican Falls. And we try to, you know, to give them a good gang to be a part of rather than joining a bad gang. We're also working on our summer program to give them opportunities in the summer to do things. So they've met people from other communities, other Junior Canadian Ranger patrols, so that when they get to high school, they know somebody. So yeah, I think the Junior Canadian Ranger Patrol can give a lot to helping that. Of course, we're not the answer, but we can be part of the solution.
Thank you.
Just a very quick question. Speaking of retention and of people wanting to be in the North, and I think one of the most important things is, are you tracking some of the results of the students who are going into, say, Yukon College, and seeing what the result is for them to be able to stay in their community? Because once you leave, it's, you know, that story, how do you get from Paris back to the farm, so to speak. But I think that's really important. And what you said about supporting education, most of us don't realize how much of our education is subsidized. And I think it's really important to maybe have a dollar value that you can actually show that, so that people here realize it's not just for the North, it's for all of us.
So I can't speak directly to that question because my job has been to bring all of the federal government together with folks across the North to really look at what we want for the future of the North and try to articulate that for the Government of Canada. But what I can say is one of the pieces of work we're doing going forward is really looking at that post-secondary picture. And yeah, I think quantifying it is really, really important, and want to look to quantify it in a number of ways. So, like, is there a reasonable path to employment after post-secondary education? That's one of the really big problems in small communities, because there may not actually be jobs for people to go to. And when I was going to high school, there were folks who could work in. I grew up in British Columbia. People could go work in the the forestry industry, or in fishing, and make a lot of money right out of high school. There was no incentive to go beyond that, because they could make a good living right away, or drop out and make a good living. And that sort of incentive of being able to participate in an economy is also a key part of this. So you can't just have post-secondary unless you have economic diversification and the sort of resource industry and government to, in fact, seek employment in. So it's a complex web.
I want to ask about a problem the CO touched on, but which you, Krista, must encounter all the time, and that is disunity among Indigenous communities and between them. We're even reading about this in the report on business now, where we see 38 communities along the route of the pipeline signing on, 3 communities at the terminus saying not a chance, or even the elected council in one community signing on, the elders or the hereditary leaders saying not a chance. You must deal with this all the time. How do you cope with internal disagreements when you ask the community, what is your opinion?
So I'm going to try to answer this question because honestly, my job is actually pretty fun, because we're talking about how to make a better future for everyone. So there's not a lot of disunity there. However, the name, the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, started out 2 years ago as the Arctic Policy Framework. And the addition of the Northern was really important, because what happened was, as we went out to communities, we discovered that First Nations and Northwest Territories and Yukon really thought we were excluding them, that this was about Inuit only, and that it wasn't intended to be pan-northern. It was really an Eastern Arctic thing. And so it was really important for us as the Government of Canada to think about that really profoundly in terms of inclusion, and try to bring our partners on board, because quite frankly, the inclusion of Arctic and Northern makes nobody happy. It's a little bit heavy to say. Our Inuit partners really want to be super important in any potential framework and really view themselves as Arctic people. Our First Nations partners feel really excluded if we call it the Arctic Policy Framework. So we've come up with a sort of unhappy compromise that, hopefully our partners will all agree to. But it's an ongoing process of dialogue and conversation about values, as well as about what we're trying to achieve. So I don't have the same problem some of my colleagues do who work on pipelines issues. I do recognize that there is enormous diversity in Indigenous communities in Canada, and that it's really important to approach questions that affect Indigenous communities directly in a way that doesn't replicate sort of government decision-making processes that have been imposed in the past, that recognizes the importance of making decisions together, and the importance in Indigenous communities of how those decisions are made being as important as what the decision actually is. So I would say it's a really, really big and tough problem and project. I think it really speaks to the commitment right now of the Government of Canada to reconciliation with Indigenous people, because I think the only way one has self-determination is if you actually listen to what people mean by self-determination. And it's not a simple question. It's really going to be really tough work for everybody. And I think one of the steps that needs to be taken is to really bring Southern Canada into the conversation that's been going on for at least since the 80s in the North, in terms of how to bring folks into the conversation, the decision-making process, which I think is one of the greatest challenges facing Canada in the next decade or two.
Thank you very much. Krista, Matt, two excellent. I'm sorry, I didn't see you come up.
That's okay.
This is the last question.
Okay.
Yep.
A quick procurement question for the Lieutenant Colonel. Are your Rangers getting the Ranger rifles, and are they happy with them?
Yes, the Rangers are getting the rifles now, and they are tickled with them. They are a beautiful, beautiful rifle, and they're talk about retention. They're a huge retention tool. It's a beautiful rifle.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.